When we think about plants, we think about their adaptations, and we also think about their extremes. Particularly when we think about plants live in oceanic and aquatic environments, but also in very dry desert environments. And these desert dry environments, like this Wallachia lives in the Namibian desert, is very kind of unique for plants because, as we have talked about, plants came from a long line of aquatic organisms, particularly green algae and other marine eukarya. And so getting to land is kind of a unique and major event that happened not only just for plants, but for all of life in general. So for the rest of this course, we're going to be focusing on actual green plants in the plant kingdom. And a quick reminder that this big kingdom includes a lot of different life forms, all the way from these seed plants up here, such as the angiosperms and the gymnosperms, to plants with vascular tissue but without seeds, and even plants without vascular tissue, and as well as the green algae, which are true plants and are considered part of the plant kingdom. When we look back across our Earth, though, it's important to kind of think about, when did plants even make it to land? When did we have that kind of jump from the ocean onto what we believe were shallow shores at the time? And if we look back at our fossil record, we see our first land plants really emerged at about 426 million years ago, during the Silurian period. And the first good fossil we have is this plant right here, named Cooksonia. There are a lot of other contradictory information that might suggest that land plants evolved much earlier in the history of Earth. Some phylogenetic reconstructions put the time period of true land plants at about 511 million years ago, and there's also some pollen evidence that might suggest a little earlier date. But as far as we know, from the fossil record, 426 million years ago was about the time that we started to see land plants make it to shore. And before we can discuss kind of the adaptations and how plants made to land, we need to take a step back and think about what was going on at Earth during that period. So during the Silurian period, the Earth was much different. It was a warm, kind of stable environment. There wasn't a lot of large ecological fluctuations going on. We had large Gondwanan continents that were dominating the Earth. And importantly, we had extensive shallow seas that kind of washed up against these continental plates. And this created kind of this warm, humid environment with, again, these inlets and pools that allowed plants to kind of interact, not just alone with the surface, but also with the kind of aqueous environment that was going on at the time. And this interchange probably was really important for the plants because a lot of these early land plants that we see in the fossil record were probably on shorelines. Most of the geological context of them suggests that they were either in shallow tidal areas or areas associated with lots of water. And the reason why we see this kind of slow creep up onto land is because land poses some very significant challenges for life, which is kind of hard for us to think about sometimes because we're such a terrestrial world now. The first off is that because there was no plants already on land, there wasn't a lot of soils developed. In fact, there was pretty much no soil. Most of the land was composed of rocky substrates with not a lot of places to get a foothold in. The early atmosphere is a lot different than what an aquatic situation is like. There's not support because you have to basically stand up tall in a gaseous environment instead of an aquatic environment. And there's a lot of differences in how you're exchanging CO2 with the atmosphere if you're not underwater, which poses really important challenges, especially because CO2 is where we know photosynthesis makes its biomass out of. When you're also on land, you don't have water around you, and you're getting directly exposed to sunlight and UV radiation. And these can really damage things like pigments or your DNA even. It's one of the reasons why we get sunburn, and sunburns can cause skin cancer in the long run. And then lastly, if you're out of water, you might not have water available to you. And so you need to be able to get water from one part of your body to the other, which, believe it or not, was a very big challenge for a lot of plants. So to overcome the first part of this with getting into rocky shores, plants needed to have several really important adaptations. Many of these early land plants, we have evidence that they had structures called rhizoids. And these are structures we see in a lot of non-vascular plants today, like the bryophytes, and even in some organisms like lichens. These rhizoids are not conducting any materials, but they're allowing these organisms to kind of grab into shorelines, especially like what we see in current environments like this rocky shoreline of Lake Superior. Rocks also started to get broken down during the Silurian period too. And while we don't know exactly how they were getting broken down, we believe that it might have been from early lichens that were actually kind of preempting land plants. We know today from, again, these rocky shorelines that lichens are really active and really good at breaking down and helping to weather rocks because of a lot of the chemicals that they exude. So early land plants, despite these kind of two things going for them, they also needed to get to be near resources and to have more stability. And they likely were really restricted to kind of lakes and streams, especially these areas where water could pool up and allow them to get a good foundation to grow. Gaseous environments also have a lot of challenges. And to respond to this, land plants have a lot of adaptations to working around without water constantly surrounding them. One of the big issues with being in an open atmosphere is that you're going to dry out very quickly. And to do this, land plants have a number of adaptations. The first thing they have is a cuticle. And this is a layer on this that covers the plants, and it's pretty much a waxy layer of cells that allows them to keep water internally. With that, though, means that you can't freely exchange gases with the atmosphere. And so to get through the cuticle, land plants have specialized cells known as stoma that are able to open and close to let in and out gases with the atmosphere. Again, so they can take in CO2 to break it down and get out O2 so it doesn't interfere with the carbon cycle in photosynthesis. Lastly, the cuticle also allows them to create structure and stand as well. By having this kind of harder out layer, it gives them more definition between the outside and the inside environment. In fact, a lot of times we see these cuticles acting in not just environmental regulation, but also as protection against herbivores. Another thing that happens when you're in this open environments is water is really good at taking out UV radiation. And so if you don't have that constantly around you, you need to deal with these high energy inputs that you're getting that could burn you. And it's kind of interesting to note that out of all the lineages of photosynthetic organisms, the green plants are really the only ones that have fully become very much a terrestrial group. And this is despite having very much similarities to things such as red algae and brown algae. And one of the reasons why green algae might have been successful is they kind of had the right pigments in order to make it on land, in order to receive all of these UV radiation that's coming in. The chlorophyll green algae has is more resistant to UV radiation than chlorophyll in red algae and in brown algae. In fact, we see a lot of times in these tidal areas, green and red algae or brown and red algae that get washed up tend to get bleached out really fast, while the green algae tend to be able to survive and wait until they get resubmerged. So this was likely kind of a lucky adaptation that led eventually to land plants. Lastly, another key component of the success of terrestrialization in the green algae was that green algae cell walls are made of cellulose, and they give them a rigid cell structure. Whereas the red algae and the brown algae, their cell walls are more made of gelatinous structures that need a constant input of water. And so when that water is kind of removed, even temporarily, they lose all structure and they're not able to be rigid. And so this was likely another pre-adaptation that succeeded in this kind of getting onto land and being good at being on land. By being in aquatic environments, it's really easy to bring things in and leave things from your body because you don't need to contend with gravity. If you think about the plants you're growing at home, like your flask plants, they have a lot of organization to them. You have roots down at the bottom and flowers at top and a stem that connects those two important organs. And land plants are able to do this because they have lots of connection tissue that's allowing them to move things up, like water from the roots, and allowing them to move things down, like sugars that are produced in photosynthesis in the green. And this is a key investment that allowed plants to flourish and really succeed in environments that you wouldn't predict they would be able to live in. These structures that are able to move things around within the plant are what we call vascular tissue. And vascular tissue varies from plant to plant, with some plants lacking it totally, but most of the diversity of plants we have today really depend on this. And these are anatomical structures that have very specific roles and play a key component in the life of a plant. The first part of the vascular tissue is xylem tissue. And xylem tissue is involved in moving water from the roots upwards. And these are composed of very strong reinforced cells. And the reason why xylem has these really strong cells is that by how they move water. Plants will bring in water to their roots through osmosis, so a simple osmotic process getting water in. At the same time they're bringing water in, they're also respirating a little bit of water through their leaf tissue, the stoma. And what this does is it creates a pressure gradient that wants to pull water up from the roots and up throughout the plant. And this is how plants basically are able to move water around into parts of the plant that need this water, despite them being sometimes hundreds of meters from the ground. And they're able to do this because of the cohesive and adhesive properties of water. Because water wants to grab other water molecules, but it also likes to attach to side things, which the xylem is highly adapted to allow. The other important component of vascular tissue of plant is phloem tissue. And phloem tissue is about moving metabolic products. Because remember, anabolism in plants, the creation of molecules, is in these plastids, especially chlorophyll, where photosynthesis occurs and makes sugars. And those sugars need to get transported to other parts of the plants for growth, development, and to defend themselves from abiotic and biotic enemies. And so phloem is about moving things mainly from green to brown tissue. And this is done through living cells that are actively transporting material. So we go from a source, such as a leaf tissue, and these sugars that are created are moved into the phloem tissue through companion cells, and these are then transported again down through the plants into a sink or a brown tissue. The phloem is also supported very much by the xylem, the water that's moving. In fact, phloem can borrow a little bit of water in order to easily and better, more efficiently transport those sugars down. So in summary, plants came onto land during the Silurian period. And when they came onto land, they had to meet various challenges that really are present in today's plants that we see. And there's many ways to get around these issues, but we see kind of trends in plants. In particular, vascular tissue has been really one of the most key adaptations we see in the plant kingdom to give us the diversity we see today.